مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم عبر ساكف. قبل أقل من 6 أشهر من انتخابات نوفمبر المقبل صدرت آخر استطلاعات الرأي. الأخبار لا تبدو جيدة للرئيس بايدن. وفقا لصحيفة نيويورك تايمز يتقدم الرئيس السابق ترامب في جميع الولايات الرئيسية الست التي من المرجح أن تحدد الفائز في انتخاباتنا. وفي بعض الولايات مثل ويسكونسن وبنسلفانيا تبدو المنافسة متقاربة للغاية، وفي الولايات أخرى مثل جورجيا ونيفادا يتمتع ترامب بتقدم كبير. بشكل عام تسلط النتائج الضوء على المسار الصعب الذي ينتظر بايدن في سعيه للفوز بولاية ثانية في البيت الأبيض. لماذا يتقدم ترامب؟ لم يكن السبب أنه محبوب أكثر، بل إن السبب هو أن بايدن فقد الدعم بين المجموعات المهمة التي تصوت بشكل تقليدي للديمقراطيين، وهم فئات الشباب ومنحدرون من أصول لاتينية والأمريكيون من أصول أفريقية. فهل ستصوت هذه المجموعات بالفعل لصالح ترامب أم ستبقى في المنزل؟ وهل سيتمكن بايدن من استعادة هذه المجموعات؟ للبحث موضوع الولايات الست التي ستقرر من سيكون رئيسنا القادم، يسرني أن أستضيف خبرائنا السياسيين أنا جيرتيلي، جون أولدريتش وديفيد هوكينز. Welcome back to داخل Washington. We're now less than 6 months before our presidential election, and the polls are not looking good for President Joe Biden. 6 key states were the target of a big New York Times Siena College poll: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona. This is where the election will be determined. What did the poll show? Let's break this down. I'm delighted to welcome Anna Geratelli, John Aldrich, and David Hawkins to explain all this for our viewers abroad. All right, David, what did the big poll show in broad stroke?
Well, just to remind the viewers that in our system in the United States, it's not the overall national popular vote that matters. It's the votes in each state. The winner of each state, depending on the population size of the state, gets to award these so-called electoral votes. And so that's why the Times and the Siena College is focusing on these 6 states, because the way our country is made up right now, the other 44 states, you can essentially bet your bottom dollar right now that either Donald Trump or Joe Biden is going to win those states. It's really these 6 states that you just rattled off that are the entire ball game. And the polling shows that in each of those states, the incumbent president, in all but one, the incumbent president lags behind the previous president, who's trying to make a comeback. In some cases, these leads are narrow, the so-called margin of error. In some cases, the who would carry the state depends on whether there's high turnout or low turnout, so-called registered voters versus likely voters. But the bottom line is that Joe Biden, if this poll is true, and the Times and Siena College think they've done a very good job of solving polling problems that have bedeviled American pollsters for the last several elections, if these polls are true, Donald Trump will be president again.
All right, so these are all states that Joe Biden did win 4 years ago in 2020. Why the change, Anna? Who are the voters that aren't saying they're going to support Joe Biden in 2024?
Yeah, we're really seeing a shift in certain demographics, African Americans, younger people, the elderly, shifts in those types of things. But really one thing that's come to the forefront is the number one issue in early voting states with the caucuses and the primaries, as well as nationally, immigration is rising to the top as the number one issue in a number of polls. And so voters who are, maybe thousands of miles away from the southern border, where this border crisis has been unfolding the past 40 months, they're as concerned as people in southern states. So, in Arizona in particular is seeing a very high number of people come across the southern border for the past 3 years. I think, immigration impacts every other thing. As New York City and Chicago, people are seeing around the country. It impacts schools. It impacts the economy. It's helping the economy, actually. But in other ways, I think it's giving some Americans concern. And certainly, if you're concerned about immigration being a negative for you, then you're probably more likely to vote for Donald Trump.
So, John, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, young voters, these are some of the core elements of the Democratic coalition that any candidate needs to get elected. Take us deep inside these pieces of the coalition and why certain percentages of them seem disaffected with Joe Biden.
Yes, let me just point out that at the outset that one of the reasons that we're in the circumstance we are is that, well, for example, in 2016, Clinton and Trump were the two least popular presidential candidates that we had measures of. That was followed in 2020 by Trump and Biden being even less popular. And my guess is it's going to turn out the same way in 2024. So that there is, except for small pockets of deeply committed partisans, there are relatively few people who are committed positively to their candidate, and so they're easier to attract away. Okay, so let me start with the Hispanics, and I think that's in some ways the most important of these groups because it's relatively large and as a group. And seems to be more winnable on either side. That is to say that Republicans can pick up more Hispanic votes than, even though there'll still be a minority of them voting for Republicans and Trump. But they're the group that is kind of like last time we talked about rural white people who were excluded from the mainstream of the economy, and so S&P driving up, it does not help them as much as getting good jobs, getting into and climbing the ladder. So they're vulnerable in the economy, and of course as voters, they're typically more likely to be second generation and older American citizens than the new immigrants who are typically unable to vote, of course. So that's one set of things. With young people, Biden has always seemed like he is an older man. Who knew?
Imagine that.
Yeah, and there has never been the close connection. It's very likely, is my guess, that it's very likely that many of the younger voters who are saying they might consider voting Republican, say they might consider voting for Robert Kennedy Jr., they're sort of searching around for something that makes them feel really comfortable. In the final analysis, it's at least most likely among the various alternatives that they will come back, but it's pretty unlikely they're going to turn out as high a number as they have in the past, which is always anyway.
And David, John just looked at Hispanic Americans and young voters. African Americans, core of the Democratic coalition. What does Biden need, and what do these polls show that he's not getting?
Well, Right. What he needs is to get the people that he's not getting. What he right now, Donald Trump is getting a higher share of the black vote than any Republican nominee, I think, since Ronald Reagan in 1984. Ultimately, black voters are a small but central part of the Democratic coalition. Black Americans make up only 13% of the U.S. population, but they tend to turn out in very high numbers when they're motivated to vote for somebody. As John and Anna, I think, would agree, and John just articulated, this is an election where the choices were the double haters. That's the biggest voting bloc of all. The people who are disdainful towards Trump and Biden. Many of those are black voters. If Joe Biden can't bring his share of the black vote up to where traditionally it's been for Democratic nominees, he's going to lose. In part because of the states we are talking. We're talking about states, almost all of which have a big city where the black vote is crucial. Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, Detroit in Michigan, of course, Atlanta in Georgia, even in Milwaukee in Wisconsin. A few thousand black votes not turning out or turning out for Donald Trump, and he could lose those 4 states and therefore the election.
So, Anna, when you look at the polling and you try to decipher it, is it your view that these voters are going to some other candidate, that they're going to Donald Trump, or are they just opting out of this election?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think John had a really good point that, younger people are not as drawn to Biden. I know I was at university when Obama had his first election in 2008 and won, and he was a younger man, obviously, than President Biden is, and he had a real appeal for younger voters. We're not seeing that, with the 2 choices, and RFK does kind of symbolize that slightly younger, little bit more youthful option. But, I think voters are, the Hispanic vote is an important part to consider as well. In Texas, roughly half of voters are Hispanic. That's a huge thing when the last 3 years, Governor Greg Abbott has been extremely loud and just aggressive with his border enforcement initiatives. It's something that Texans, I feel like, are very aware of what's going on at the border and pushing people further west now to cross into California and Arizona because it's so difficult in Texas. I think it's something that, young voters are seeing impact coming out of college, looking at certain jobs. Latinos in Texas are thinking, is this something that is going to be, impacting me personally, and then making choices based on that.
And John, when you look at this in a historical perspective, do disaffected voters tend to cross over, or do they tend just to stay home?
It's very difficult to get them to turn out. They're more likely to stay home, and it's sort of fickle. So you spend a lot of effort on mobilization. You may get some of them to come out, and they turn out not to end up supporting all of your candidates you thought they were going to, because of their lack of sort of deep commitment to a set. But I think the biggest thing is going to be the question of turnout, especially turnout in the competitive states.
All right. When we come back after the break, we're going to take a look much more specifically at those competitive states and see what are the variables that might shift any of this over the next 5+ months. In just a moment. My guests again today include Anna Giratelli. Anna is the Immigration and Homeland Security reporter for the Washington Examiner. She has reported extensively from America's southern border. Previously, she reported for CQ Roll Call, Yahoo News, and The Oregonian. Also with us is David Hawkins. David is senior editor of The American Leader. He was also the founding editor of thefulcrum.com, and he spent 2 decades as a senior editor at CQ and Roll Call. to must-read news sites covering Capitol Hill. And with us from Durham, North Carolina, is John Aldrich. He's the Pfizer Pratt Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Duke University. He has authored several books about American politics and political science, including Why Parties Matter and Before the Convention. All right, let's take a closer look at these 6 states. Joe Biden, as I said earlier, won all of those 6 in 2020. He needs to win at least 3 of them, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and win all of the other states that he won in 2020 if he's to repeat again and stay in the White House. Right now, he is only ahead in one of those states, Wisconsin. So if you look at Michigan and Pennsylvania, what does he need to do to get over the top? David?
Well, I'm talking to you from Philadelphia, the biggest city in Pennsylvania, which is the biggest prize of all of these swing states with 19 electoral votes. It is also the state that Joe Biden calls home. It's where he was born. His current home is just across the border in Delaware. It's a sort of a joke in Philadelphia that he seems to be here almost every week. And he is, but his message, which he tends to like to talk about the economy in Philadelphia and occasionally when he goes to other parts of the state, just doesn't seem to be resonate. They don't seem yet to be able to sell this notion that Bidenomics, which is a term they don't like to use anymore, has worked, that the economy is actually better than the consumer feels that it is, that the investments in infrastructure, which you now do see all over the state. I just drove across the state a couple of days ago talking to voters, and there's public works projects popping up all over the place. But voters don't seem to understand that is a consequence of legislation that their president pushed through Congress. So he needs to do a better job talking about that. And then he seems, I would say, and we would all agree that in every state, he needs to spend more time, he and Kamala Harris, the vice president, talking about the one issue that these swing state polls show he is leading on quite clearly, which is the issue of abortion. So that seems to be the key app. But in Pennsylvania, there's a softness, there's a flatness to his support. It's not an excitement. There are Trump signs, billboards all over the highways in rural Pennsylvania, and there's just no sign of his presence.
Anna, you spent a lot of time in the Southwest. Nevada and Arizona are 2 of the states that currently have the largest Trump leads among these 6 states. Is there anything that Joe Biden can do to narrow that and pull ahead in either of those 2 states?
Yeah, I think he really needs to talk about crime and public safety. In Las Vegas, we've seen incidents where immigrants who have come across the border illegally and maybe been released or just evaded police have been involved in some really serious crimes, some fatalities and murders. And so I think, just the idea, certainly, it's not something that President Biden wants to associate with, saying that this border situation under my presidency, has, been related to these crimes happening. But I think he needs to really, support police and at least come out a little more, toe that line of supporting police, but not being buddy as President Trump would be, to signal to people that he's aware of crime being a concern. He's aware of, like David said, abortion, especially with young women voters. It's something that I think is really enough to get women out to the polls and to vote come November.
John, there's a couple of variables out there. In your view, would a Trump conviction in the New York trial or this crazy story about Robert F. Kennedy having a worm in the brain, do these things on the margins affect enough voters to matter?
Conviction of felony, you would think, would have some kind of effect. It doesn't seem to be the kind of effect so far that we would normally expect, which would be negative. It seems to be rallying his troops around him. So each of these states and more, including my own, have they're a little bit like the nation as a whole. They have deep blue spots, they have deep red spots, and in between, I mean, Pennsylvania, I'm from Pittsburgh as a kid. It's been described as Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Alabama in between, but that sort of exaggerates the polarization. But there's polarization within each state, and that means there's going to be small sections of each state that are available for winning one way or the other. We tend to focus on suburban, particularly older, and some of the exurbs as people sort of removed from the city, but not completely in the rural areas, as being available for winning. If you think back to 2016 and the importance that Wisconsin had in determining the outcome, it's generally thought that Hillary Clinton's campaign failed to target the minority population, particularly in Milwaukee, sufficiently to turn out enough to carry the deep blue parts over the redder parts.
Very interesting. So unusually for an election, at least one foreign policy issue is playing a role, with the president sometimes tacking this way, sometimes tacking that way on his support for Israel in the Gaza war. We spoke about a New York Times poll. There was an interesting New York Times opinion piece by pollster Mark Penn, who helped get Bill Clinton elected twice, who said that Biden would be making a mistake by moving away from Israel, that it's politically over, as John Fetterman shows in Pennsylvania, it's actually quite popular among most people to support Israel. Is this having any impact on any of the states? I know, David, in Pennsylvania, is this having an impact?
It is having a particular impact on college campuses, and there are many top tier colleges in the states we're talking about. Pennsylvania is one of them. Curiously, polls of young voters show that the Israel-Hamas conflict is not top of mind for most young voters, but it is the topic that gets them the most energized. There are not giant protests at college campuses about the economy or about crime or about abortion rights. They are about Israel and Hamas. And there are many of these young people who say that once the academic year is over, that their summer job or their summer pursuit is going to be taking these protests elsewhere, including to Chicago, where the Democrats will meet to formally nominate Joe Biden. Chicago famously was also the site of the convention in 1968, where against the Vietnam War, it turned violent. It was arguably the death knell for the Democratic ticket and for the rise of Richard Nixon, that protest. So if these young people follow through and come to Chicago and raise hell, for lack of a better phrase, and suggests that the Democratic Party is in disarray, that remind people that Joe Biden is taking a different approach than they want to take, this could be harmful, significantly harmful. So Penn, we're talking about places like the University of Pennsylvania, University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan, University of Pittsburgh.
All right, John Aldrich, Anna Giratelli, David Hawkins, thank you very much for joining me this morning on داخل واشنطن. وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بحملتنا الرئاسية قبل 6 أشهر من إجراءها، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر @InsideWashington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. وإلى أن نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.